Thank you, Leanne, and a special thank you to all the personnel here at the People's Forum for hosting this meeting this evening. It's wonderful. And there was one mistake. I'm not the co-author of Red Zone. I'm a co-author of the introduction. Fortunately, we will have the author. We will have the author of Red Zone speaking to us very shortly. This is one of the first of many meetings that will take place around the United States and around the world in the launching the use of Red Zone and Zona Roja in order to defend the Cuban Revolution and explain what a real, genuine socialist revolution really is. But there's no conceivable way to begin our meeting here this evening except with a rousing salute to the great fighter for Puerto Rican independence, Rafael Cancel Miranda. That's it. Much like Fidel, he defied all the odds, and he died peacefully in his sleep in his bone bed in Puerto Rico earlier this week. But as a friend and comrade requested, he said, "I want no flags flying at half-mast for me, and not a moment of silence, only a renewed commitment to the struggle and to go forward from there." So I think it's in that spirit that we are having this meeting tonight. Rafael Cancel Miranda could easily have been here with us, as he was on many, many occasions in all of the battles here in the United States, in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, and many other fronts of the class struggle around the world. We have nothing but gratitude for his decades of leadership and the determination to fight as he did for the causes that he embraced. The last time that I had the privilege of being with Cancel Miranda and hearing him speak was actually about 8 years ago in Washington, D.C., when he spoke at the meeting that was organized on the occasion of the Cuban Five beginning their 15th year in prison that year. And he had come from Puerto Rico to join us in that meeting. And I remember he began with both his opening and his closing words were absolutely memorable. He opened by saying, "Why do we fight for the Five? Because we are fighting for ourselves. We are not doing them a favor. We're doing ourselves a favor because we're fighting for our own freedom." And then he went on from there for the rest of his message. And at the end, he came back. He said he was talking about the condition, the circumstances and the conditions and what was happening in the world around the time that he and the other Cuban or Puerto Rican nationalists were released from prison. And the pressure that was building internationally, because he was saying that's the kind of pressure we will need also to get the Cuban Five out of prison. And he said, and that's when Fidel stepped in. He said, and when I say Fidel, I'm saying Cuba. Because if you look for a government that really represents the people, there is one and only one in the world, and that is Cuba. And he said, I was 23 years old when I walked up the steps of the Capitol. Today I'm 82, and I haven't changed the way I think about anything. Except that today, perhaps, I'm a little more revolutionary because I know the enemy better. Today, it's we who thank the Cuban Five. We thank them for the example they are giving us. And today, it's we who thank Don Rafael for the example that he gave us around the world. So let's, in that spirit, tonight we have a wonderful panel of speakers. We're actually waiting for Asha Mateus, who is on her way, but we decided we should go ahead and start anyway because we have a couple of things that are very important speakers before she will be speaking. We'll be talking, including with the author himself, as I mentioned. This book is a vivid first-hand account of the actions taken by the Cuban government and its diplomatic corps, the ambassadors who were in Africa at the time and the others, and many support personnel in Cuba, the families and so forth. The story of the more than 250, it was 256 exactly, selfless Cuban doctors, nurses, medical technicians who played a decisive role in eradicating what is the worst outbreak in history of the Ebola virus in the countries of Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. Above all, it's an introduction to the Cuban Revolution is what this book is. Because the men and women that you will meet, you will hear about this evening, you will meet them in the book. Their discipline, their courage, their selflessness, and the joy with which they approached everything that they did, including with that telltale and inimitable Cuban humor. Those are the men and women who embody really what is the beating heart of the Cuban Revolution. The revolution is not a thing. It's human beings. It's the men and women who made that revolution and defended it for all of these years. And as Fidel said many years earlier when he was sending off one of the first contingents of medical volunteers on one of the first internationalist missions, he said, it's only a revolution that can achieve such feats as these men and women are doing. It's only a revolutionary people. Sorry, okay, please let me know. It's only a revolutionary people that can carry forward such tasks. And that's what Red Zone is about, and it's what we will be talking about tonight. The book was first published 3 years ago by the Casa Editora Abril, the publishing house of the communist youth in Cuba. It had a magnificent reception in Cuba, but of course, Casa Editora Abril could not fulfill the demand for this book around the world and the need for it in other languages. I don't know how many times in the course of those last several years that we've had that Pathfinder Press had this book on its distributing it everywhere that we could, and how many times people came to us and said, "Do you have that book in English?" And we did not have it in English. So the suggestion actually came from one of the Cuban Five heroes, now the vice rector of ISRI, the Institute for Higher International Studies in Cuba, Gerardo Hernandez, who suggested to Abril and to the author, Enrique Ubieta, that maybe Pathfinder would be interested in doing this book, and came to us and asked us if we would do it. We said, absolutely. We need it badly also. And we all need this book badly politically today, encountering all of the slanders and lies and political attacks on the Cuban Revolution, and especially on the medical cooperation around the world in the way that it is being portrayed in the U.S. press and many other places around the world. We won't be able to capture the richness of Ubieta's account just in a few one evening of a meeting. But you'll begin to get a taste of it. The book was launched in Havana as part of the Havana International Book Fair less than a month ago, at a meeting that was sponsored by the Cuban Institute for Friendship for the Peoples, ECAP, as it's known to many of you, at their Casa de la Amistad in Havana, with a packed audience, much like this, of well over 100 people, including numerous of medical Cubans who had been involved in medical missions internationally, a substantial number of African students studying in Havana today, some in medical school and elsewhere, numerous veterans of the Cuban Revolutionary Wars and struggles over the years, including General Gustavo Chui, the Chinese-Cuban general who was badly wounded in the fighting in the defense of Angola against the South African attacks there during those magnificent years of struggle. Also included Colonel Leonardo Tamayo, known to many of you as Urbano, one of the co-combatants with Che in Bolivia in the 1960s. The panel that presented the book included not only Gerardo Hernandez, as I said, I call him the godfather of this book, of these editions, Victor Drake, who was co-combatant with Che in the Congo, and later led the international effort in Guinea-Bissau during their years of struggle against the Portuguese colonial dictatorship. It included the head of the Cuban International Mission in Guinea on the Ebola mission, Carlos Castro Barras. It included the head of the mission in Sierra Leone, Dr. Jorge Delgado, as well as Martin Copel, who you'll be hearing here later this evening, and others of us. There's a display at the back of the room there that shows some of the pictures, and I think on everybody's seat there's a copy of the article that ECAP posted on their website about the meeting. After that initial presentation of the meeting, there was also a presentation at the Pedro Curi Institute of Tropical Medicine, which is known worldwide for its work. It's where all of the doctors were trained, who went and other medical personnel who went on the Ebola mission, and it's also where the author of the book, Ubieta, spent his 21 days of quarantine when they returned from the reporting mission that is recorded in the book, Zona Roja. Without anything further, I would like to introduce our first speaker this evening. It is the Ambassador Ana Silvia Rodriguez, the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations mission. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be in the People's Forum. We feel like home here. Because of you also, we feel at home here. First of all, I would like to thank the Socialist Workers' Party for organizing this event and this panel, especially at the time when an intensive and defamatory campaign is being orchestrated by the government of the United States with the support of some like a government against the Cuban cooperation in the health area. We also would like to recognize Pathfinder Press for its permanent battle against the media and the cultural colonialism, and also for supporting the Cuban Revolution and for spreading the Cuban reality that is so much intended to be to misrepresent, silence, and sometimes denigrate. I'm not going to talk too much about the book. Other colleagues are going to do so. The book for me was excited and at the same time moving. Sometimes I cry, sometimes I laugh, but most of the time I feel very proud of my people. And not only about the book is mainly about the Cuban personnel, health personnel working in those countries where the Ebola was the outbreak of the Ebola, but also I feel proud of the Cuban diplomats. Most of the embassy in those places closed their missions. We did something different. We opened new embassies. We opened embassy in Liberia and we opened embassy in Sierra Leone. The Cuban battle against Ebola is one of many stories about the Cuban cooperation in the health area. Abnegation, unlimited self-giving, altruism is common denominator in the attitude of our health workers, both in the struggle against Ebola, also the fight against blindness in Latin America. Most of you remember Operation Miracle. The fight against cholera in Haiti, and the participation of the Heart Relief Brigade in many countries all over the world. The attachment of our people to our revolutionary principles and values in which Cubans have been educated after the triumph of the revolution also characterize the Cuban health personnel. I think that we have solidarity, internationalism in our DNA. Based on that principle, Cuba officially began the international medical cooperation back in 1963 in Algeria. You have to take into account the Cuban Revolution triumph in 1855. At the beginning of the revolution, a lot of doctors left Cuba. But at that time, we started the premise that we do not share, we share what we have, not what we have left. So we decided to go to Algeria and offer some doctors despite that we don't have too many in our country. Cuban health personnel put aside material interests and traveled to remote, extreme poverty-striking areas. Our doctors are not going to the big cities. Our doctors are going to poor communities, to places where maybe for the first time when the Cuban doctor arrives, they see a doctor for the first time. They are going to places where a doctor is not a necessity, sometimes a luxury. And as I told you, they are putting the interest aside. There's no material interest in their doing. I have been working in other missions abroad. I remember when I was in Trinidad and Tobago at the time, my husband, that he couldn't come because he was with the flu, and because of the coronavirus, we don't want that. And I remember that in Trinidad and Tobago, we have a big brigade there, more than 100 doctors, and I was talking with one of the Cuban doctors, a lady, and she told me that she was in Eritrea. She was in a very remote community in Eritrea. She was the only Cuban there. She can meet her peers only twice a year to celebrate the 26th of July and the triumph of the revolution. She told me that she cries every day, and because of the condition how she was living, and explaining to me the conditions. So imagine that the director of the hospital gave me a bucket of water every day in order that I can take a bath. But he gave me the bucket of water every day because he told me that he studied in Cuba and he knew that Cubans like to bathe every day. And she told me that sometimes she soaked a towel and put it on top of her because the hot was unbearable, so she couldn't sleep. But also she told me that every time that the head of the brigade called her and asked her, "Are you okay?" do you want to come back? She said, yes, I am okay. I'm going to finish my mission. So money is not in the equation of the Cuban cooperation in the health area. Money cannot buy life. Money cannot get back moment that maybe our collaborators miss, the births of their children, the graduation of their children, the birthday. So money is not part of this equation, but this is part of the campaign, that we are doing this for money. So for decades, even, and until today, Cuban are covered most of the expensive on those nations with most unfavorable economic conditions. So we are cover most of the expensive in those countries. But also, and besides, in line with United Nations views of South-South cooperation, in other countries, we offer this cooperation on the basis of complementarity and partial compensation for service rendered. So this is both. One, we cover all that expense. In other, there is a kind of agreement between the two countries, and the country that have maybe they have the resources to do it, they compensate the work of the Cuban. We do not use our medical, that also is part of the campaign. We are not using our medical cooperation as a method of doing politics. Even I remember when the coup d'etat in Honduras, that our brigade remained there, because we understand that we are working for the people of that country, not for the governments. So Cuban medical cooperation is based on the principle of voluntariness. Nobody is obliged to go to the countries. And if you read the book, and I encourage you to buy it, you can read it in one day. Yes. I start reading, and I only stop because I have other things to do, but I read it in 2 days. If you read the book, you are going to see that when the countries of Africa asked our government, and when the Secretary General of the organization, of the United Nations Organization, and also the Director of the International Health Organization, approached to Cuba and asking Cuba to provide the medical doctors, and the Cuban government asked our professionals who want to go to those countries, 12,000 doctors, nurses, and technicians offered themselves to go. 12,000, knowing that they are going to a life-threatening mission. Because every time that they asked them, they said, do you know that you can die? And they knew that. So 12,000 offered themselves to go. But only, 256 were selected to the mission. But we have the possibility to select more doctors if the conditions allows. In the book, if you can find several testimonies of the medical personnel that participate in the fight against Ebola that demonstrate this affirmation. Sometimes amaze me how quickly they say yes. Because if you think twice, you say, well, I'm going to a place that maybe I can die. But the majority of them don't give more than one thought to the idea to go to the places. We never talk, because we are not doing publicity on this issue. But it's important to know about the figures, about how the cooperation that Cuba offers, how many lives we have been saving with this cooperation all over this year. From 1960 to the present, we have often solidarity aid, and this is not the whole cooperation, but only solidarity aid to 39 countries through 33 emergency brigades and 28 brigades of the Henry Reeve contingents. More than 400,000 health professionals and technicians have fulfilled the honorable mission of saving life and raising health indicators in 164 countries. In 56 years, more than 1.8 billion patients have been treated. Actually, currently, we are in 65 countries with almost 30,000 health professionals and technicians. More than 348 million surgeries have been performed, and almost 14 million children have been born to the hands of the Cuban professionals. More than 3 million ophthalmic surgery have been performed as part of Operation Miracle. I feel very proud that I was part of Operational Miracle when I was working in our embassy in Grenada. That was amazing. This started in a nutshell, and in 2 days we have a team of doctors going around the country assessing the people who need the treatment, because it was different kind of treatment. And sometimes, I remember that we are 2 or 3 in the morning, we receive a call from the office of the Comandante Fidel Castro, and they say, we are going to send you aircraft the day after tomorrow. So for all of us, oh my God, I have to fill this airplane. And for me, was I feel very happy when I called maybe a 90 years old lady and said, do you want to go to Cuba to have a surgery tomorrow? And she said, yes. So we have, I don't remember how many airplanes, but that was the opportunity that those people have to see again. Was the only opportunity that people have to see again. So had it not been for the timely involvement of our doctor, 6.5 million people would have lost their life. Medical consultation, 1.9 billion. 13 millions of surgical procedures. And I can go and go and on. We cannot talk about the Cuban cooperation without mentioning ELAM. Because our idea is not to have our daughter all the time in the countries. Our idea is to create the personal capability, to create the capacities in those countries in order that they can provide themselves with their doctors. That was the idea of the ELAM. And the idea that the doctors, the students that we are selected came from the most disadvantaged community, because the idea is that they can come back to their community and retribute to their community with their work. So ELAN is also part of this and a brilliant idea of the commander Fidel Castro. And we are doing that despite them being a small country under a blockade for more than 50 years. A blockade that have an impact, a very negative impact in our health sector. Just last year, from April 2018 and March 2019, the Cuban health sector lost, because of the blockade, 104,148,178 because of the embargo. 6 million more than the last year because of the embargo. The translator of this is sometimes life that we cannot save. That's the reason why that we say the blockade to Cuba is a genocide. It's a genocide because sometimes the lack of access to the drugs, the lack of access to the equipment impede us to save life. So we cannot buy technologies, the diagnostic kit. We cannot buy equipment, spare part. I remember that some years ago, we make a big purchase of medical equipment, high-tech medical equipment from a company from a European country. This equipment we're buying for all the Cuban hospitals. And a year after, we couldn't use it because the company was bought by an American company, so we couldn't receive anymore the spare part or the maintenance of the equipment. So millions and millions of dollars were lost in this with this purchase. But I'm not going to make this longer. I want to assure you, I don't have to assure, I know that you know that. Despite of the blockade, despite of the millions of dollars that the government of the U.S. allocates toward the Cuban medical cooperation, Cuba will continue saving life and offering health care and well-being throughout the world to the extent of our possibility, wherever we might be required to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You can speak as long as you want. I'd like to welcome Asha Samad Mateus to come and join us at the table, because we were saving a seat for you. Okay? All right. All right. Our next speaker will be a very special showing on these screens over here on the side, so you'll have to turn your chairs a little bit to see these. This is a special message that was given to us by Enrique Ubieta, the author of Zona Roja and Red Zone. He's also the editor of Cuba Socialista, the theoretical magazine of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, and a very experienced journalist who has written also extensively about the Cuban medical cooperation in Central America and in Venezuela. And when he was asked, if he wrote why he was writing so much about doctors, he said, "I'm not writing about doctors. I'm writing about the Cuban Revolution." That's what these books are about. And this was a message that Enrique recorded for us to use here this evening and at other meetings, solidarity meetings around the country and around the world, as we maximize the use of this book in that campaign to answer the slanders of the U.S. government. Okay, so if you'll watch the screen there, you will very soon see Enrique Ubieta come to life.
Ustedes conforman un gran equipo, un gran contingente de personas que de alguna manera han sostenido también desde afuera los logros de la revolución. La revolución se sostiene desde adentro, por supuesto, pero se sostiene también con la solidaridad de todos los pueblos del mundo. Así ha sido durante muchos años. Es decir, ese concepto de solidaridad ha sido también un concepto permanente en la propia revolución cubana hacia otros países. Es decir, la hemos recibido, la hemos dado desde los primeros años del triunfo. Es decir, forma parte del concepto de qué es una revolución, de qué es un país que intenta construir una sociedad más solidaria. Yo quiero hablarles específicamente del libro Zona Roja, de la experiencia que tuve como periodista, como escritor en África Occidental, porque el hecho de que un grupo enorme de cubanos, de médicos cubanos, quisiera ir quisiera estar presente en ese proceso de curamiento, de curación, de intento por salvar a tantas vidas humanas en una epidemia que estaba causando muertes, muchas muertes a los propios trabajadores de la salud, cuyo origen todavía no se definía con exactitud. La manera en que se curaba tampoco era muy conocida, o no estaba bien elaborado un protocolo de cómo actuar en esos casos. Y sin embargo, muchos médicos, ante el pedido de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, un pedido absolutamente inusual, es decir, a un país del tercer mundo, un país pobre, un país bloqueado, es decir, en lugar de pedirlo a una gran nación desarrollada, aunque también se dirigió a los países que habían sido anteriormente metrópolis, habían colonizado a esos pueblos en África, pero los que enviaron los médicos fueron los cubanos, fue Cuba, ¿no? Un país pobre. Y eso ocurría por la larga tradición que existía en Cuba de solidaridad con África y con el mundo. Ahora, esas personas que dijeron, yo quiero estar allí, que después hubo un proceso de entrenamiento y un proceso de selección por el currículum de cada uno de los que se propusieron y por las habilidades que demostraron en la preparación también. Eso fue un acto que estremeció al país, a la sociedad cubana. La sociedad cubana, de pronto, se dijo, bueno, estas personas que han nacido en nuestro país, que son nuestros vecinos, nuestros familiares, están apostando por ir a un lugar donde pueden morir. Ellos mismos tenían conciencia de eso, en varias ocasiones lo dijeron. A veces el encuentro de ellos con sus familiares antes de partir era dramático. Los familiares muchas veces se sentían estremecidos ante esa posibilidad y ellos insistieron, es decir, ellos se plantearon ese problema como un problema elemental de humanidad. ¿Qué encuentro yo en estos países? Bueno, son sociedades que han sido esquilmadas por las metrópolis europeas, bueno, Estados Unidos en su histórica relación con Liberia, Francia con Guinea, Gran Bretaña con respecto a Sierra Leona, y sociedades donde este tipo de epidemia puede crecer muy rápido, precisamente en función de esas carencias históricas que propician el analfabetismo, que propician también la hambruna, las enfermedades que acompañan a la enfermedad central que es el ébola. Eso es lo primero que hay que ver, pero son sociedades con una cultura rica, multiétnicas, donde los médicos cubanos llegan y se incorporan estableciendo un vínculo muy especial. Yo creo que una de las grandes virtudes que tiene el médico cubano es que trata a su paciente, en primer lugar como paciente, no como cliente, jamás como cliente, pero lo trata con un sentido de igualdad, de ser humano a ser humano. Es decir, no hay ninguna postura de superioridad frente al paciente, y eso el paciente lo siente. Es decir, el paciente siente cuando una persona es capaz de tener una relación de igual con él. En África, los médicos llegaron e introdujeron nuevos métodos de trabajo, incluso desechando algunos aspectos del protocolo de la Organización Mundial de la Salud, que se planteaba no tocar prácticamente al enfermo, no tocarlo, no usar la vía intravenosa, por ejemplo, tratar de protegiendo, paradójicamente, no al enfermo, protegiendo al médico, ¿no? Sin embargo, los galenos cubanos pues introdujeron otras maneras de abordar la enfermedad, que fueron seguidas después por otros especialistas de otros países del mundo. Allí se produjo algo muy especial, que fue la relación sin ningún tipo de politización de europeos, norteamericanos y cubanos que colaboraron para salvar vidas. Estamos hablando de médicos norteamericanos, ¿no?, que estaban allí, o de especialistas norteamericanos que construyeron también algunas de las instalaciones en algunos de los lugares, con la colaboración de los cubanos que también sugerían, bueno, creemos que debe ser de esta manera, opinamos esto. Esa colaboración fluyó de manera natural, porque el gran enfrentamiento que existe no es entre pueblos, es entre un gobierno con ansias históricas de dominación sobre nuestros pueblos de América y sobre Cuba en particular, y un país que intenta ser independiente, que intenta sostener con dignidad su desarrollo, su vida. Es decir, ese es el verdadero problema que entorpece la relación entre pueblos, que es una relación histórica que puede construirse de una manera natural. Yo creo que lo que ocurrió con el ébola fue una enseñanza, precisamente por el impacto mediático que tuvo, fue una enseñanza de lo que era posible hacer desde un país, desde un Estado revolucionario dispuesto a colaborar con el mundo, y de lo que nuestros médicos y especialistas son capaces de entregar con toda disposición. Yo creo que cada una de estas misiones son subversivas, y perdonen que use esa palabra. Siempre Fidel les dijo a los médicos que salían de viaje que no podían hablar de política, que no debían entrometerse en los asuntos internos de los países, que debían colaborar con las autoridades eclesiásticas, religiosas, y con las autoridades gubernamentales, que debían ser activos defensores de las relaciones que pudieran establecerse y que pudieran beneficiar sobre todo al salvamento de vidas, que había que curar al rico y al pobre, al liberal y al comunista en iguales condiciones. Siempre se planteó ese problema. Pero ¿por qué resulta subversivo? Resulta subversivo porque es un Estado revolucionario que demuestra en la práctica que solo son necesarias políticas de Estado para que muchas personas que hoy en el mundo pierden la vida por enfermedades incluso curables puedan conservar la salud. Es decir, esa presencia cubana en el mundo demuestra que el sistema internacional de salud está orientado más al enriquecimiento de unos pocos y no a la salvaguarda de la vida de los seres humanos. Y eso realmente toca un punto neurálgico en la comprensión del sistema. Los cubanos que van a estas misiones llegan a Cuba siendo mejores personas. Ellos lo dicen, ellos lo saben. Yo creo que eso es una ganancia invaluable para Cuba. Llegan a Cuba siendo mejores revolucionarios, porque muchos de ellos viven, comparten situaciones que no existen en Cuba, enfermedades que no existen en Cuba. Agradezco a todos ustedes que estén reunidos defendiendo sus ideales, defendiendo a la revolución, defendiendo lo que significa la revolución en el salvamento de vidas, en la elevación de la calidad de vida, que no es solo la calidad material, es también el fortalecimiento de la dignidad de los hombres y las mujeres, de su capacidad de participación social. Les agradezco eso, y bueno, por supuesto, les agradezco la posibilidad de hablarles hoy a través de esta cámara. Gracias.
And in reading Red Zone, you'll learn a lot more about those subversive activities of simply treating human beings with dignity and respect and saving lives. And the impact, and it's precisely why the U.S. campaign against the Cuban medical cooperation around the world today is so strong and is so and is so pointed and is so day after day around the world in all of its different forms, because it is so powerful. Just that example of what a socialist revolution changes, the kind of human beings it produces, and what we're trying to fight for, the kind of revolution in the United States that will allow us here to join with our brothers and sisters in Cuba to build a socialist world. Our next speaker this evening, is Professor Asha Mateus from the City University of New York. She teaches anthropology and Black studies, African studies, and is often invited visiting Cubans and to speak in her classes. Made the speeches of Thomas Sankara, Nelson Mandela, and other African leaders part of her curriculum. And we're very pleased to have Asha with us tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here in such a warm, progressive atmosphere. And I thank so much the sponsors of tonight's program, first of all, for having it, because for years I've thought that what Cuba has been doing around the world to help less developed countries needs to be known by a broader group of people, and that it would help to counteract the negative lies and propaganda that the government of this country always has, supported by certain elements from Miami and elsewhere, that tell lies about Cuba, about how horrible it is, how it is destroying and trying to contaminate other countries with its horrible ideas. And they need to know the facts. This is one book that will help achieve that, because unfortunately most media doesn't cover it. And the majority of the people, including those who watch the media every day, who went to college, etc., don't know what Cuba is internally, and they don't know what Cuba's effect has been to other countries around the world. So really, the sponsors of today's program are to be commended for putting this in English, in print, and I have suggested to them that they need to do volume 2 soon, which is about other contributions. This is, of course, a very important, critical one that saves so many lives. But Cuba has been, for decades, around the world in less developed countries, doing medical work as well as other work that has been invaluable. This is not known by most educated even, educated in comillas, Americans, by people who every day read the media, listen to the radio, watch the TV. They're not going to get it. Occasionally, BBC World News, Al Jazeera even, and many others put something on, but the regular media, no. So what am I speaking about? I want to talk from personal experience. My own eyes have seen certain experiences that I'd like to share with you. And it's very important because around me, I found some people praising Cuba and other people condemning it. And when my brother and I and other people I know wanted to even visit relatives, no, that place is dangerous, they won't let you leave. Can you imagine? No, seriously. When our students, we organized study abroad programs to Cuba, and we had to convince the parents that it wasn't dangerous, any more dangerous for them to go to Cuba than for them to be here. And many of them told me, if they go to Cuba, don't come back here to my house. Yeah, some of them had left Cuba, and for the students to go and see the real Cuba would have led them to question other things perhaps they had gotten from the same people. But in addition, many of them meant well. They really had heard that Cuba was so dangerous and that Cuba would not allow their precious child to leave at the end of the study abroad program. So, to the contrary, some of the students who went just for a summer or just for one semester wanted to stay longer. And Cuba, of course, had no reason to hold them. So, but just the fact that they went, they were not such big groups. So we did have one chancellor of CUNY, and he was very progressive, and he started on all levels, especially the graduate level, students could go and get credit, and they could go to Cuban universities, they could do research, and his name was Murphy. And he was opposed by many of the other administrators and leaders, but he insisted, no, a university is supposed to be a place where we can have open dialogue, research, and so on. So that happened. That made a tremendous difference. Other universities across this country also started doing some of the same things. Not with huge groups, but even if they had 25 students in graduate school doing something like this, it opened the eyes to others of possibilities. All right, besides going to Cuba, meeting their counterparts, some of them live with families, most live in hostels, but just meeting their counterparts, this was a wonderful thing, a wonderful thing. But while many were there, including me, they also met students from all over the world, less developed countries, who were studying in Cuba. So some of them were not aware that there were in Cuba so many foreign students. But we visited schools that they had, secondary schools for foreign students on the Isle of Pinos. We visited schools on the island itself, outside of Artemisa, other places, and we met many people from all over, from the island and from all of these countries. So this was an eye-opener too. Meanwhile, these are people who are graduates doing graduate work. And in a few cases, we got visas for a short time for undergraduates too. But many of them had to go other ways, such as charity tours and other ways that people managed to get there when it was difficult. So what do we learn from this? Some of them maintained ties with the people they met. Some didn't. But just having had those ties, having seen that Cuba could have such a high percentage of foreign students, and in the secondary schools, they were even teaching them in their own languages, teaching them their own history and culture and so on, as well as Cuban teachers for the more scientific subjects. All right, in addition, we went to other parts of Cuba, such as especially Oriente, where we visited other schools, found the same thing. Cuban students, foreign students. We interchanged in a casual level, not on formal tours. Because some people said, well, the tours, of course, they're going to show you the best. And some people were living with families, and they were surprised to see that they were not starving, because they have been told here, you'll be starving when you get to Cuba. Or you'll just be eating rice and beans. What could be a better combination meal? After all, it's certainly better than the standard mashed potatoes with gravy or steak, etc. It was a healthy food. We had never been told about the green belt around the big cities and the salad and so on and so forth. So it was, people were surprised sometimes when relatives came to visit or when people would go home that they had gained weight. But not in a just a flabby way, but they also had been walking a lot, participating in swimming and other things. So that was one very important experience. But even more so, I went to visit several places, to visit relatives, friends, in-laws, and also with study abroad programs from my university and two other universities I work with, Wesleyan University in Connecticut and Trinity College in Connecticut. And so what did we see? What were those countries? In the Caribbean, one was Guyana. And another one next to it was Suriname. Both of these countries are fairly well developed compared to others in the area, but at the same time, they didn't have many medical professionals. And almost all the medical professionals in the region were private doctors. Some were doctors who had come from India and other places, a few China, and they were also private doctors. In every place we found one or two local doctors, also private doctors. So the problem was, if you didn't live in the capital, you were not close to any specialist or even any hospital. So when the Cubans went to those places, and I saw the same thing later in Grenada, I think they had 7 provinces. Not a big island, but very mountainous. And if you don't live near the capital, where everything is, in terms of medical services, anything else of high level, you're in trouble. So when the Cuban doctors went there, they started something that was amazing to the people that we stayed with. They said, now we don't have to go to St. George's, the capital, if we want to see a doctor. The doctors, I think it was 3 days a week or something like that, the Cuban doctors would go to the provinces. And then they would access people who needed treatment. Those they could treat in the provinces, they would do that. Those they couldn't, they would arrange transport free to bring them to St. George's, to the hospital, for treatment. Not only that, I had an in-law who was a nurse, a Grenadian nurse. And she and her friends, they said, are they real doctors? So we said, why do you say that? Well, they don't act like doctors. What do you mean? Well, one van comes to pick up all the doctors who work on a certain shift. One van, and some of them even sit next to the driver. You know? So I thought they were joking at first, but they weren't. So they said, and they can even, when they have a break, they can even sit down and play dominoes with the staff or with other people waiting for treatment. So in other words, they were human. They were not, I'm the doctor and so on, and no one should talk to me except through my assistant. And of course, I couldn't sit next to the driver. Horrors. So in any case, these things may not sound like much, but it made an impression, even on the nurses and doctors. The doctors here didn't like them because they were private doctors and these were free doctors. The private doctors did not go into the rural areas. The Cuban doctors went. They'd be 3 days or half the week, approximately 3 days, I don't remember exactly, in the capital, at the hospital, and 3 days in the provinces. So this was a big change for them. I heard the same thing happening in other places I went to. But this was really a wonderful thing for the people. Imagine, first of all, the doctors were free. Secondly, they were accessible and available even if you live in the rural area. Third, you didn't even have to have a car or money to take the bus. It wasn't a bus, it was a van. So this made medical treatment not only available but accessible for the average person. And this, I found every place I went where they were stationed. They were very much respected, but everyone said they don't act like real doctors. They just don't act. Their attitude is just, they just seem like ordinary people. And I was amazed. I heard that in about 4 countries. And, but, all right, so then, what else? Besides those countries, in the Caribbean and South America, where did I see them? Where else? Well, first in Tanzania. In Tanzania, I have some in-laws who live in a place where they had a station. It's called Arusha, Tanzania. And it's in the northern part of Tanzania. And it's near Mount Kilimanjaro, that area. So, but they were not only there, they were in different areas of the country. But, and we would, once we had a 26th of July celebration in Dar es Salaam, the capital. Well, it's the commercial capital now. It used to be both commercial and government capital. But anyway, what did they do? The Orquesta Aragon was supposed to come, but they were delayed someplace else in the continent. So what did they do? They took some of they had those big records then, and they gave it to local Congolese Tanzanians, and they had it for 2 days. They copied it fantastically. We had a wonderful, wonderful program, and if you hadn't told people that they were not Cuban, they would have never known. Some of their relatives had studied in Cuba, some of them, and they knew wherever I went, the Cuban doctors and other Cubans were highly respected, were not, people talked, I don't mean just praising, but giving specifics. Somebody was able to see, somebody was able to have a baby even though the other doctor said impossible. Somebody was able to do this or do that. And these are mostly routine medical things that they just couldn't afford or didn't have access to before. Most of those places have very few other doctors, and they're almost all private. So the average person who's quite poor, what can they do? They do have some good herbalists, and in Tanzania they actually have a center, Institute of Tanzanian Traditional Medicine. But it can't do everything. It can treat certain things and prevent some things. But the Cuban doctors have made a tremendous difference. I was also in Somalia and Eritrea. I didn't get to Ethiopia when they were there, but I heard the same thing from Ethiopians here. That the same thing I've described before, I don't want to repeat it, the same sort of situation. They had filled a gap that made medicine and healthcare available to the average person. They didn't have to wonder, do I have to spend my family's food money to pay this doctor? Do I have to give the doctor some of my land, which they did in places like Grenada, they told me, and Guyana. They used to, if they had no money, the family had a piece of land here, they would give that, sign it over to the doctor as payment for the treatment. They didn't have to do that. All right, so let me tell you a sad story. Very sad. I was once visiting somebody at Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. And anyway, in the parking lot, I went with someone who was driving. I don't drive. So in the parking lot, I met somebody, and he looked West African, but he was talking Spanish like a Cuban. So I listened, and then I said, "You went to school in Cuba?" He said, "Yes." He was from Guinea. He spoke French, he spoke Malinke, he spoke Spanish. And so I said, "I have a meeting, but when I come back, can we talk?" So we did. He had studied medicine in Cuba, sent by the late Sekou Touré, the first prime minister of the country. He was part of a group sent under that government. He was there 5 or 6 years. He had studied and been trained as a surgeon. He had also married a Cuban woman when he was there. All right, so when he went home, they all went home at the end of their program, and he was planning to make arrangements to bring his wife to join him. Unfortunately for him, the government had changed. The new government did not want to encourage or support in any way those sent by their predecessor, which was an opponent. And so, because of that, they would not give him visa, and they didn't even want to hire some of the doctors because they wanted them to leave the country because they knew they had all been with the other party. So he said some of his colleagues did leave. They had to make a living. They had to, their families had been without them for years, and some of them, like him, he had a wife and child in Cuba. He couldn't get a visa. So somehow he got here, thinking maybe he could do it. The United States would not give a visa for his wife either. If he had been a Cuban who defected, a Cuban doctor who defected and went to Puerto Rico, Miami, or here, they would have given the visa for the whole family and given stipends and everything else. Up to now, Cuban students from exiled families in my university and others are still getting money, regardless of their family's income or ability to pay. They get not only free tuition before the government made it free a couple of years ago, they get other stipends as refugees. Not only that, Soviet Jewish refugee families are still getting it, even though the Soviet Union is not existing anymore. So it all depends who you are. If he had the same degree, but he was from a Cuban defecting doctor, he could have brought his whole family. Since he wasn't, And they knew that if he was sent to Cuba, his government then at least must have been pro-Cuba. They wouldn't help him in any way. So this is one example. He said he was so sorry. Had he known that, he would have stayed in Cuba if he could have, but he had no idea. So this is a waste of a talented person who was educated to a high level, and he's not the only one. But luckily, most of them are working in their countries, and they're doing a wonderful job, and they are also respected. I've met a few of them. I have to go now. They're giving me the signal. But anyway, I would say I have met others, even from India, going to study in Cuba. But they were not getting the same, they were not on the same kind of program. There are some who go as foreign students do here. But I'm saying for the thousands, and I don't know how many, of students from all over the less developed world that studied mostly medicine, a few engineering, in Cuba from various countries, the world, and their co-citizens, wherever they are from, are grateful. They don't even realize it sometimes, but we need to publicize it. That's why I'm begging the sponsors to make part 2 of the book about the other things Cuba has done. I'm not saying it's just as important as Ebola, but it's also important. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha, and for the future editorial program of Pathfinder. Our next speaker this evening is Martín Coppel, who's the principal editor of the Pathfinder edition of Zona Roja and Red Zone, who was part of the recent the recent activities in Cuba in the presentation of the book there during the Havana Book Fair and the other and several other events. Martín is also the co-author of the book Capitalism and the Transformation of Africa, which tells the story of the Cuban medical cooperation in Equatorial Guinea, which in the kind of first-hand reporting that he did from Equatorial Guinea on 2 different trips a few years ago, is very much part of the experiences that Asha was just describing, and that are part of what comes through in the pages of Zona Roja on the kind of medical cooperation that the Cuban doctors and nurses and medical technicians give everywhere in the world. So with that, Martín, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mary Alice. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I can't extend it anymore. But thanks to the People's Forum for hosting this event, and it's really an honor to be here with Ambassador Ana Silvia and with all our friends from the Cuban mission, with our compañera Asha Samad Mateus and the experiences that she conveyed to us. I was also glad that we began by honoring our comrade Rafael Cancel Miranda tonight, because, among other things, I never heard any more effective defender of Cuba's socialist revolution than Rafael Cancel Miranda. Okay, that's better. Okay. I knew that was possible. Rafael, when he talked about Cuba, when he was asked, why do I support Cuba? He didn't begin with, they have a good health and education system, however important that was. He said, because they are free. Because the Cubans are millions of free men and women who know what they're fighting for and have been fighting for. And what's the lesson of Cuba? We need to do the same. As Mary Alice said, I was part of a team that spent nearly a month in Havana in February, and I want to start with the response we found among ordinary Cubans, one person after the other, talking about their response to the most recent U.S. attacks against the Cuban Revolution. As you know, over the past 2 years or so, Washington has stepped up its economic sanctions to restrict Cuba's imports of oil and other supplies, access to hard currency. The U.S. has ended cruise ship stops, limited direct flights to Cuba, restricted family remittances from Cuban Americans here. And this squeeze has a real impact on the economy and on daily life, as people will tell you. The shortages of fuel, medicine, detergent, a drop in income from tourism, more limited bus transportation, lack of paper to print books. But most striking to us, I think, was the widespread mood of determination to resist these imperialist pressures. The lack of illusions that the U.S. economic war is going to be eased anytime soon. And in face of this, a stiffening backbone and a calm confidence in face of the future. And people would tell you, you know, they've tried to defeat us for 60 years, the U.S. imperialists, and 12 administrations in a row, Democrats and Republicans. And it won't work any better for them this time either. They would say, we survived the 1990s economic crisis, a very severe economic crisis after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the special period, Cubans call it. Yes, we face real shortages of material goods, but we have no shortage of human creativity, and we will make sure that no one will be left on their own. Of course, this was not universal. We talked to some who were distraught over the possible future shortages and hardships, but the determination, the lack of panic was the predominant sentiment especially among working people. And it was more evident than during the Obama years in the times that we've been there, when many in Cuba had the hope, the illusion that the Obama White House might represent a real change for the better. We saw the outrage at the U.S. rulers' attacks on Cuba's working class internationalism that was captured so well by our compañera, ambassador to Cuba, to the United Nations. The pride in the example of the tens of thousands of volunteer doctors serving in countries around the world. And people would say, how dare the U.S. government try to prevent our medical teams from saving lives in Latin America and elsewhere? What moral authority does the U.S. government have? They're shameless, and we must answer these lies, these smears against our army of white coats, as they are known. And I think the enthusiastic response to the Red Zone book was part of that reaction and that pride. In the preface to Red Zone, Roger Calero and Mary Alice, the two authors of that, say, this is not a book about doctors, epidemics, or medical care. Above all, and they quote the author Ubieta, it's about the solidarity and the internationalism that are at the heart of the Cuban Revolution. That's why this book is such an effective weapon for us here in defending the Cuban Revolution and telling the truth. And I hope we all leave here looking for further opportunities to use Red Zone, to get it into broader hands of people to help counter the U.S. slander campaign and to win support for the Cuban Revolution. Cuba's example helps explain with concrete facts what a socialist revolution really is. At the launch of this book, hosted by the ECAP, the Cuban Institute for Friendship with the Peoples, Enrique Ubieta said that the mission to fight Ebola, the Ebola crisis, he said, was not the work of doctors working on their own. Behind them was an entire country and a revolution that made this possible. And I think that captures it very well. In fact, Cuba's response to the Ebola epidemic in 2014 broke through the capitalist media lies against the Cuban Revolution here in the United States. And we can remember the day that the arrival of the Cuban doctors in Sierra Leone was in October 2014 was first reported on the front pages of U.S. dailies. We knew that Fidel's army of redcoats had struck a powerful blow, which also brought much closer the day that of the release of our brothers Gerardo Hernandez, Ramon Labanino, and Antonio Guerrero, the last three of the five Cuban heroes and revolutionaries who spent 16 years in U.S. prisons for their actions in defense of the revolution. At that time, as working people here read about and heard about Cuba's exemplary commitment in West Africa, they were surprised, and many wanted to know more. How was that possible, and why does the U.S. government hate Cuba? The response by working people there and their communist leadership was nothing new. It was just one more example of the course that began well before January 1959 with a revolutionary struggle that brought to power a government that wields state power to defend the interests of workers and farmers. That shows what international solidarity, as opposed to charity, as Fidel always explained, really means. At the Havana book presentation, one of the speakers, Victor Dreke, who fought with Che Guevara in the Congo and then led a group of Cuban combatants who joined the independence war in Guinea-Bissau, Dreke reminded the audience of Cuba's long record. He mentioned the doctors who went to newly independent Algeria in 1963, as Ana Silvia explained to us, who served in Angola, doctors who served in Angola as part of the 425,000 Cubans, volunteers who helped defeat apartheid South Africa's invading armies in Angola. And the doctors who served in Central America and Haiti since Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And in countries even where Cuba didn't have diplomatic relations. Nicaragua under Somoza in 1972, Pakistan in 2005, not to mention Fidel's offer to send 1,500 volunteer doctors to Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, which Washington callously rejected. And you'll read more in the book that Mary Alice mentioned, Capitalism and the Transformation of Africa, of other examples, like the examples that Asha talked about in great, vivid detail. In response to the Ebola epidemic, Cuba provided what was most needed and what no other government, least of all Washington, provided or even pretended to deliver. 250 doctors and nurses caring for desperately ill human beings and their families traumatized by this deadly disease. Doctors and nurses who treated patients with dignity and respect, as Ubieta explained, who went as volunteers and who went not to advance personal careers but to save lives at the risk of their own. Cuba's healthcare system and the international solidarities are products of a socialist revolution. They can't just be grafted onto the United States or other capitalist countries. They can't be reproduced by people whose social relations haven't been transformed in the course of revolutionary class struggle as we see in Cuba. As Che pointed out, drawing on his own experience as a doctor and as a revolutionary, he said, "To be a revolutionary doctor, first we must make a revolution." At the Havana presentation, one of the speakers, Dr. Castro Varas, who was the head of the Cuban medical brigade in Guinea, he said, "We're not heroes, we're health workers." How many doctors in the United States they identify as health workers? The revolution, he said, the revolution has taught us to go where we're needed. What does that mean? What does that mean, socialist revolution? In January 1959, Cuban workers and farmers, led by the July 26 movement and rebel army headed by Fidel Castro, overthrew a bloody dictatorship backed by Washington, and working people took state power. They overturned the rule of the capitalists and landlords, both foreign and domestic. And using that state power, peasants carried out a land reform that guaranteed land to landless peasants and put an end to evictions forever. 250,000 young people, volunteers, went into the countryside and wiped out illiteracy in 1 year. And the educators themselves were profoundly educated by those that they worked with. Racist discrimination was barred, and those laws were enforced and have been enforced. Workers took control of the capitalist industries and banks, which were nationalized to organize the economy on the basis of human needs, not profit for a few. Women broke out of the confines of the home and became massively integrated into the workforce, unions, political life, at all levels. Millions were organized into militias in the Revolutionary Armed Forces and successfully have defended Cuba from U.S. invasion and military threats ever since. The revolution unleashed the capacities and creativity of millions and deepened their self-confidence. As Malcolm X said, Cuba, that's a real revolution. And it's a powerful living example for us here in the United States, not just simply something to applaud from afar, but what we can learn about what we need to do right here at home. It shows the class road the working people need to take as well. Also, you know, we're constantly told by our exploiters that the brutal values bred by their system, by capitalism, everyone for themselves, that's human nature, and that nature can't change. It can't be changed. Well, Red Zone refutes that lie, and you can see that in the people that come alive there. It gives a vivid picture of how the internationalist volunteers and millions of people throughout Cuba have been transformed through a deep-going social revolution. That's why when the Cuban government appealed for medical personnel to fight the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, as Ana Silvia said, 12,000 volunteered in just 3 days. Of those, 256 were chosen for the mission and underwent rigorous training when we were invited to present this book at the Pedro Curie Institute for Tropical Medicine. The workers there described to us with pride the rigorous training that they gave to the volunteers. Ubieta in the book interviews Dr. Luis Escalona, one of those who was chosen, and you'll read his testimony. When Escalona heard the appeal for volunteers, he immediately called an official at the hospital where he worked. And in the book, he recounts, the official told him, "We're looking for people willing to go to West Africa and fight Ebola." And this is what he says. I replied, "Sign me up." The official said, "You could die in Africa." I repeated, "Sign me up." He added, "If you die, your remains will stay in Africa for 5 years and your family won't be able to see you." I told him, "Well, if I die, what will it matter where I am?" So he laughed and he said, "I didn't expect anything else from you." Red Zone gives story after story that conveys that spirit of the volunteers in their own words. It's really wonderful. And this book, as others have explained, answers effectively Washington's slander campaign against Cuba's medical cooperation around the world, the grotesque lie that Cuban doctors who volunteer for missions abroad are slaves, victims of human trafficking. This is what we hear from the U.S. government and its allies. Just one example in the book says it all, and that's the example of Dr. Felix Bias, who was part of the medical brigade in Sierra Leone. He was the only Cuban doctor who contracted Ebola. Before he was flown out to a hospital in Geneva for treatment, Felix Bias pledged to his co-workers and patients that after recovering, he would return to complete his mission. And he was treated, he recovered, and he did return to his post. And in the book you'll see I lost the page here. But you'll see there's a picture of Dr. Felix Bias as he's wrapped in protective gear to be flown to Geneva. And then when he's there, you can see him with a big smile on his face back in Sierra Leone. And when we were there, you could tell in Cuba, everyone you talk to knows about Felix Bias. He's a hero. They're proud of what he represents. And we were told we weren't able to meet him because we were told he's now serving in Angola. The reason the U.S. rulers target Cuba's medical cooperation is precisely because that living example is such a powerful argument in countering the lies against the Cuban Revolution. Millions of people of the world know firsthand about the Cuban volunteers, as we've been told. This smear campaign is part of the 6-decade-long economic and political war by the U.S. ruling families and their two-faced political party, the one-faced Democrat and the other-faced Republican, and their war to defeat the Cuban people and ultimately try to return the country to capitalist hands. This imperialist offensive against the Cuban Revolution is not a Cold War relic. It's not irrational. It's very rational. It responds to class interests, and the powerful example of the Cuban Revolution for working people elsewhere is a political threat to the U.S. rulers and other ruling classes around the world, especially in today's world. And that's why they will never stop trying to destroy that example, whether it be through economic warfare, whether it be by trying to corrode the class foundations by exposing Cuba more to the pressures of the world market system and to their capitalist values. What Cuba's working people have achieved is in sharp contrast to what millions of us face here in the United States and around the capitalist world. In Cuba, whenever there's a hurricane or a tornado or the danger of exposure to an international epidemic like the coronavirus today, working people and their government in Cuba organize and take the necessary steps to protect the entire population. And that's what they're doing right now in response to this latest health crisis in the world. In contrast, we know what happened when Puerto Rico, under Washington's colonial boot, was hit by Hurricane Maria or the more recent earthquakes, the natural disaster that became a social calamity that continues to this day. The same happened in Florida and other states after Hurricane Michael hit, when workers and small farmers were devastated, and you can think of many other examples. And today, we don't need to be health experts to know that the U.S. government and medical establishment at all levels are not going to respond to the health crisis around coronavirus and that outbreak in a way that really protects the population, whether in the United States or in the world. Not to mention the diseases and conditions that have long ravaged the semi-colonial world: malaria, tuberculosis, cholera, AIDS, malnutrition, high infant mortality, that kill 3 million people every year in sub-Saharan Africa, that are the consequence of imperialist plunder, which Ubieta describes in detail in the book with figures and facts. In the U.S. and throughout the capitalist world, as we know, medical care is a commodity. If you have to go to the doctor or you have to go to the hospital, we know the first thing we're asked is, how will you pay? In the U.S., we don't have a system of medical care. What there is a system of medical insurance for the profit of a few wealthy owners. In Red Zone, you will see the chart showing how medical expenses has steadily increased every year for the average family in the United States, and that's just in the last 10 years. And of course, this is part of the broader crisis of the capitalist system that we're living through, part of the decades of accumulated attacks on our rights and living standards and conditions. Of course, these assaults push working people to resist. Just to mention one outstanding example, today is the nearly 5-month-long strike by copper miners in Arizona, showing solidarity and fighting the boss's attempt to break their unions and, among other things, to triple the cost of their medical insurance. It's because of these conditions that we've found such great interest in Red Zone among workers and young people everywhere. And what we find in this book, what the Cuban workers and farmers have accomplished, underscores why in this country, too, it's working people who have the potential power to organize and to lead a transformation of society. And it shows the way forward for working people, political way forward of organizing independently of all capitalist parties and governments. I'm sure people will think of opportunities to circulate the book, people that you know, opportunities to get it broadly into the hands of those who want to learn about the example of the Cuban Revolution, whether setting up a community event or a campus meeting, or teachers that want to use the book in their classrooms, or events such as the Harlem Book Fair, and I'm just mentioning many more that you can think of. The Red Zone will be a useful tool for those attending the upcoming International Cuba Solidarity Conference that will take place in New York in a couple of weeks that we'll hear an announcement on. It'll help in building the May Day Brigade and other trips to Cuba for people to see the Cuban Revolution for themselves. And that's just the beginning. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, we'll go back up on the next one. Okay, thank you very much, Martine. I'd just like to mention that some of the photos that Martine was referring to and the the chart on the medical price costs for they're on the wall over here for those of you who would like to take a look at them after we finish. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is that when we were in Cuba, we also learned that an edition of this book in French has just been published, also in France. Apparently, we're trying very hard to get some copies of that because we know we have great need for those here as well, and we'll keep you posted on that front. You can look for it on the Pathfinder website, but I don't think it's going to be very quickly. It will take a while. Before we open the floor for some discussion and questions and comments from everyone who is here, I want to ask Ike Nahum to come up and to tell us about the conference on the International Conference for the Normalization of U.S.-Cuba Relations, which will take place here in New York in a couple of weeks. Ike.
Thank you. I want to thank Pathfinder Press for inviting me here tonight as a representative and organizer for the New York, New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition to promote the upcoming International Cuba Conference for the Normalization of U.S.-Cuba Relations, which I'm sure most of you, many of you here are familiar with and hopefully will attend. There's cards in the back that gives you the website and can fill you on all the information about it. I think many of you here are familiar with the conference and will hopefully attend. And that's a conference that stands on the shoulders of the conference that was held, the National Cuba Conference, the first in March 2017, and which many of us worked to make a good success. It is also my great privilege and honor to share the podium with Ambassador Ana Silvia, Asha, Martine, and Mary Alice Waters. And I just would like to say that Mary Alice, I consider a mentor, as many of us do, on these and many other questions, who's educated and helped us to understand the reality and legacy of the Cuban Revolution for many decades. And I thank her for that. The March 21st, 22nd effort has been marked by an even greater unity and broad collaboration of our Cuba Solidarity movement, spurred on by the stepped-up escalation of accumulating anti-Cuban measures under the direction of the Trump White House, but with bipartisan support, or at best acquiescence by many liberal and conservative capitalist politicians that would say that they formally oppose the embargo. These measures, as Martine and others indicated, are aimed at nothing less than the asphyxiation of the Cuban Revolution. And part of this campaign is the political aggression marked most grotesquely by the campaign against Cuban medical internationalism. This forum and the timely publication of this magnificent book is an important response which tells the truth. And at the conference, we will also be highlighting this, countering these obscene slanders, and also trying to get this book into people's hands. While Cuba has turned its embassy in China into a medical emergency center and is working with the authorities in developing drugs and testing potential treatments, at this very moment, Trump and his anti-Cuba bipartisan gang of allies are trying to get Cuban doctors expelled and vilified around Latin America and the world. I would also point out that these anti-Cuba policies are reversing the very limited concessions that were made in the second term of the Barack Obama administration, have sharply escalated following the failure, the debacle even, of the attempted military coup earlier last year, led by Washington with thoroughly bipartisan support to overthrow the sovereign Venezuelan government. So stepped up imperialist aggression has compelled us to achieve a united front of activists and organizations against the U.S. economic and political war and in solidarity with the Cuban socialist revolution. So check out the website that's on the cards. Get the word out. Panels, we have a great set of panels, people coming from all over or moving forward despite concerns that are in the background and really out of our control about the coronavirus and how it might impact on us. One thing I'm sad to announce is that the delegation from Cuba that had actually even gotten visas, which was a big victory, to come to attend the UN International Women's Month activities and also our conference. Those activities have been canceled by the UN and unfortunately will not be able to come, but we know that our friends at the Cuban mission here and at the Cuban embassy in Washington will be attending and participating. So again, I want to thank Pathfinder Press for this magnificent book, fully in line with the amazing arsenal of books that are among the best tools for Cuba solidarity organizations and activists. And I want to also thank Pathfinder and the cadre of the Socialist Workers' Party for being great bulwarks and stalwarts decade after decade in defense of the Cuban Revolution, hard workers and leaders of coalitions here in New York and around the United States. Thank you for your uncompromising proletarian internationalism. And for all of us have learned what proletarian internationalism is by the example, the heroic example of the Cuban Revolution, which is again represented and shown in this book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ike. And we all, of course, hope that that conference 2 weeks from now will go forward. But as Ike indicated, by the way, Ike is the principal organizer of this conference. And you know, some of those circumstances will be beyond our control. I think we probably have about 15, 20 minutes for some discussion, comments from the floor, contributions, questions for any of our speakers. With that, we'll open the floor. There's a microphone here that we'll pass around, and Peter will have it. And okay, just please keep comments short so we can get as many people in as possible. Okay, all right. Okay, right here. That's. Do you have the, yeah, give it. No, why don't you come up here so people can hear you.
Well, we have in Cuba what we call the Integral Health Program, in which we have a doctor for around 150 persons in the community. So we call them the family doctor. Those are specialists. They are graduated as a general doctor, but after that they go to a specialization that we call integral medicine. Is what we call. Most of the background is gynecology, pediatrics and general medicine, and they are the ones who are taking care of the community. Because many years ago we realized that in order to avoid a tertiary level of attention at the hospital that is very costly, we have to prevent. So prevention is the key. That's the reason why we put the doctors in the community to take care of the people. So those doctors know the families where they live. They know not only what are the illness of each of the member of their community, but also know the social problem of the community. So they are not only doctors, they are social also workers. So you asked something about coronavirus, I didn't got it. It's about how Cuba we are doing. Thank God that we have Cuban television here. No, we at the mission, we can see the Cuban television. As every country, we are preparing for coronavirus. We increase our epidemiological alert at the border, at the airports and ports. We are not closing our borders. We are receiving everybody. We are, people that are going to go to Cuba, you see that at the airports we have doctors and nurses there. Not with because of the coronavirus. We have it regularly. So, yes. For example, I'm going to tell you how was the following. I arrived to Cuba from New York 5 weeks ago. I was on vacation. I went to Cuba with some flu, and my husband also. I was better, but my husband has some cough and fever. So when he arrived to the airport, he said that he has some cough and fever. The following days, so we have to give off all of our information. The following day, a doctor came to our house. Immediately, we arrived like at 2 p.m. So the following day in the morning, the doctor of my community already have the information about us and went to see us. And, asked a lot of information. The following days, the doctor continued calling us until we decide, we are okay, we don't have any problem, it was a common flu. But this is in the way that we are following, the same we are doing with tourism. So now we increase, of course, the surveillance. I think that at the airport we are having the equipment to take the temperature of the people. We start having in the hospital building a specialized unit in case we have coronavirus in Cuba. Until today, we don't have any case of coronavirus in Cuba, but we already have tasted. I think the president yesterday, I saw a meeting with the president, with the Council of Ministers and a lot of institutions talking about how we are going to take care of this situation. And he mentioned that we are creating these rooms in the hospital to take care of coronavirus. But he also mentioned that we already tested more than 300 people, but were common flu, nothing regarding with the virus.
Well, just a couple things. When we were in Havana for the Havana Book Fair and had an international team there at the Pathfinder stand. One of our members had flown in from Australia, and I think there were people on the plane who had been in China or one of the other affected countries. And after he arrived at the hotel, he immediately was visited by someone from the Ministry of Public Health, and was told that they were going to follow up on him. Apparently, they must have done that with all the passengers in that airplane, and when they determined that all had turned out negative, then they didn't need to follow up. But it was an immediate response, and it really gave you a sense of confidence that the Cuban government at all levels is doing exactly what it has a long record of doing, including in China, where many Cubans have family members are very concerned. And we would read in the newspapers precise, accurate information with no panic, but enough for people to know that their loved ones were safe. To my knowledge, there's no cases, as far as I know, of the Cubans working or studying in China who have gotten ill, but carefully monitored and the public is informed. And the other thing, the things that Ana Celia was talking about, but that struck me in just reading some of the news reports, is the emphasis, the approach. Well, Cuba is clearly the only government in the world that really is fully prepared as best as possible to respond to, as they say, to minimize the introduction and spread of the illness. And the key has been what is done at the neighborhood level. The family doctor and nurse that Ana Silva was talking about. I also read about the involvement of the unions, of the local neighborhood committees in defense of the revolution. The Federation of Cuban Women and other mass organizations are involved to organize the population and to make sure that people are taken care of and their health is monitored. They're holding health workshops in neighborhoods and workplaces. And Cuba is drawing on past experience in how they combated the Zika and other contagious diseases. Medical students in Cuba are undergoing training to be prepared to participate in the response to the coronavirus. And then there's something that Cubans sort of take for granted, but when I read it, the President Díaz-Canel at one of the televised meetings of the government bodies that are meeting every day to organize plans, he just said, if you have any symptoms, go see your doctor. It's pretty basic, but that's an active encouragement and concern for the welfare of people, which, is that's the starting point for everything.
Okay. Another question here. Okay. Is it? And then one here, and then back there. First. Yes.
There was one aspect that the ambassador briefly touched on, but it has to do with, again, related to the way the Cubans conduct themselves in the world. And it has to do with the development of medications, treatments, and vaccines and things like that. I remember hearing years and years ago about the Cubans having developed some kind of treatment for, I believe it was meningitis, or a certain strain of meningitis. And unlike the way medical breakthroughs are handled under capitalism, where it goes to the highest bidder and these patents are held for decades and pharmaceutical companies can do and charge whatever the market can bear for AIDS or any life-saving treatments, that the Cubans sort of allow, I don't know what the word for it, but instead of patenting and profiting off of their own innovations and developments in medicine, they make them available to humanity through partnerships with more advanced industrial companies that manufacture them and so on. And I remember being in meetings sort of similar to this, where somebody was describing that there was somewhat of discussion, I think it was during the special period, about, well, but this would be an amazing source of hard currency for Cuba, which we need, is that when we develop a vaccine that we sell, that we can sell it. And Fidel's response to that, and the response of the Cuban government, that no, we don't. To us, medicine and scientific breakthroughs are also not commodities, just the way medical treatment is. And I'm wondering if any of the speakers could discuss that a little bit, because that's a really, for us in the United States, everybody knows, just the way medication and science is held, captive to the interest of capital.
Okay. Let's take the one other question back there, and then we'll take both questions and then answers. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
First, thank you to the People's Forum and to Pathfinder and everybody involved in this publication, and of course the Cuban doctors. My question is, now that there is an English translation of this book, and you mentioned an already published or upcoming French publication, I'm wondering if anybody knows about the publication, circulation, or general availability of this book in West Africa, particularly in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, if that's happening or it's going to be happening.
Okay. Okay. On the first one, do you want to take that, Anna Sylvia?
under our health public system, we try to make available to the population all the vaccine that they need. That's the reason why many years ago, even in very special moment during the special period that we call, Fidel Castro decided to create the Biotechnology Institute. This institute is another scientific institution that are working in that area. We have drugs that are at the world level. Even there are some of them that only Cuba produce, like the Everpro-P, that is a drug in order to avoid the diabetic foot, the amputation. Despite of the blockade, we cannot make available this drug to U.S. But we are working, and maybe some of you have read about it. I think that this is the only thing that still is going on, and it's from the Obama period. We have the first joint venture between Cuba and the Roswell Park Institute. Cuba produced a vaccine for lung cancer. This is a therapeutic vaccine. We are having trial here in the United States. The trials are going better than we expected. And this is, I think, the only project that could continue going on, because a lot of projects that we had with the previous administration were canceled. We are not doing anything. So just right now, I think that, Mary Alice, you mentioned, we are facing a lot of difficulties in Cuba in order to provide to the population all the medicine that they need because of the strengthening of the embargo to Cuba. So there's the willingness of the Cuban government to solve this problem, but we need to buy the raw material from other sources. We produce the pills with the vaccines in Cuba, but we need to buy the raw. And sometimes it's not the problem only that we cannot have the supplier cannot give us the raw material. Sometimes it's the problem that we cannot pay. We cannot pay. We have the money and we cannot pay because the financial, the embargo to Cuba have been strengthening the financial area. So the banks don't want to make transactions with Cuba because they are fear that the U.S. Government are going to sanctions to them, exactly. So this is the situation right now, but still those different institutes are being working, maybe with less resources that we used to have, but we continue working in order to try to solve the polluting of our population and those diseases and or illness that maybe don't have treatment, but we are working to try to find treatment for that. So this is where we are now.
Maybe I should probably take the question on the distribution in Africa. Of course, the fact that we now have the book available in English, especially, was one of the primary objectives of doing this. And in the discussions that we had with compañeros and compañeras in the public health ministry in Cuba, they're very interested in being able to get this book around, especially in Africa, and we're looking for ways to collaborate on doing that. But the difficulties that Ana Silvia was just referring to, of all of the sanctions and difficulties in trade with Cuba, become a factor even on that. But the main thing is that this is a job ahead of us right now, to do everything that we can to find ways to get these books around, not only in the United States and other in other countries where we have where Pathfinder Press has substantial distribution, but in the places that, like in Africa, especially through all of the political activities that we find various ways of doing. Often those are together with comrades from Cuba in the solidarity activities in Africa, and so forth. But it's a job that is just beginning now. That we have the book available to do this in this way, and any suggestions and any help and any ideas that people have on these questions, you should be sure to let us know, so we can see what we can do to follow up on that, and begin this very, very important work on the thing. Yes, Asha, please.
I forgot to mention two very important things about the Cuban doctors I observed in Africa and also in South America. Most of them went there having studied the language of the people. Now in Suriname, such a small country, small population, and their language is almost like the language of the Boers in South Africa, but they're not going to use it anyplace else. They were specially trained for that place they were going to. So they can communicate, and they do, with the people speaking Sarantongo there, speaking Swahili in Tanzania, speaking Somali. So these are not easy, especially Somali is not an easy language. But the other thing is that they also were involved in upgrading the training of the people working with them, the local people. They would raise their level of qualification, help them move up as technicians, and then some of the younger ones, they would work with local people, the local government arranged to send them to Cuba for professional training.
Okay. I think we may have time for one final question or comment if anyone is ready. Okay. What? If not, you? Okay, Martine. Yes. Okay. All right. We'll take a final comment from Martine.
A real good complement to Red Zone is this book, Capitalism and the Transformation of Africa, that Marielle has talked about, that she mentioned, because it presents another component of the example of Cuba's internationalism, in this case in Africa, and particularly in Equatorial Guinea, which was one of the most underdeveloped countries in Africa by the legacy of colonial plunder until the development of the discovery of oil and the beginning of the expansion of that industry. But we were able to go to Equatorial Guinea on 2 occasions. That was the basis for this book. But in Equatorial Guinea, Cuba has maintained a permanent team of doctors. That's part of what they call the comprehensive health system, and that those teams are all over the world. And in fact, they were in West Africa before the Ebola epidemic, of about 160 doctors. And we were able to travel throughout the country, more than 10 cities in Equatorial Guinea, and it's the Cuban doctors who really sustain the primary health system in Equatorial Guinea. Secondly, in Equatorial Guinea, Cuba has built and set up a medical school. It's one of the several countries where there's Cuban-initiated medical schools in Africa, training Ghanaian students to replace the Cuban doctors, as Ana Silvia explained. And through that process, as we visited the 4 major hospitals throughout the country, the director of each one of those 4 hospitals was a graduate of Cuban medical school. So you could see the real progress, the difference it makes in parts of the world where Cuban doctors have served, and the example they give. I'll just end with just one other thing, which is captures the difference between the imperialist approach and the revolutionary approach of the Cubans towards healthcare. We were invited to a meeting of the Malabo Rotary Club once, and because the head of the Cuban Medical Brigade was asked to give a PowerPoint presentation, Dr. Leonardo Ramirez, and he gave a presentation about Operation Miracle, the program to do the eye operations for people that were threatened with losing their eyesight. And so the doctor outlined a proposal from the Cuban Medical Brigade to procure a bus that could go all across the country as a rolling laser eye surgery clinic, and to perform the estimated 3,000 operations that would literally wipe out blindness due to cataracts and related vision problems in a matter of a few months in the country. He projected that the entire project would cost $100,000 plus the cost of the bus. When he finished his presentation, the book says one of the Europeans, but I remember it was the French ambassador. He asked the Cuban, "Sir, you've used the figure of 3,000 Ghanaians who need this operation. Could you give me the price for treating 10? And the report is written by Merrill, says, Leonardo was great. Without missing a beat, he politely replied that the difference in cost between treating 10 people and wiping out cataract blindness in the whole country was so minimal as to be not worth discussing.
Okay, that's a wonderful place to end our program this evening. I'd like to invite all of you to browse the table back that's available there, the photos and so forth. The book, Red Zone, Zona Roja, is available at a very special price for the meeting only tonight of $12. So we urge anybody who has not gotten a copy yet to consider that right now. And you'll also find copies of The Militant, which carries much of the reporting and on these activities and the kind of information that we've been talking about this evening. And finally, I'd like to just let everybody know that there will be an open house reception at the Pathfinder Book Center, which is just one half block down the street here on 37th Street. The address is 306 West 37th Street. 13th floor, and there's a little slip of paper like this that's available that has the information, and everyone is invited from 8:30 on. We're already past there at that time now, but please take some time to informally to talk and relax, and then all those of you are invited to come to the reception. Thank you very much.